This was in June in Asheville, North Carolina. My boyfriend and my dog and I were camping along the Appalachian Trail, along the river where we were kayaking. We had got done kayaking for the day, and we were relaxing at our campsite before dinner. Our site was only like 10 feet from the trail, and the river was right behind that. We had some dramatic and stressful events while kayaking that day, and we needed to unwind and relax. We were running low on weed, so we had just eaten some edibles because we are stoners and why not? My boyfriend was half asleep in his hammock. I was at the river's edge, and I was laying on a towel near the tent when a man came walking up to us, blabbing about giving us his trash. I was at first confused, but he was wearing a backpack and an Appalachian Trail shirt, so I quickly realized he was a serious hiker on the trail and wanted us to take his trash for him, which is a pretty reasonable request. However, we were only a 5-minute walk down the trail, and there was basic civilization, including a dumpster and whatnot, literally 5 minutes down the trail. I told him this because I'm sure he would rather just put it in the bin himself in that case. But he then pulled out a large bag of weed and said I could have some if I took his trash. I was a little confused, but I would never turn down free weed, so I was like, sure, whatever, we will throw it out. He gave me a small handful of nugs and threw his trash into our bag, and I asked him some small stuff like, "Oh, are you through hiking?" and whatever basic stuff. He said he was and had been for a couple of months, and asked if he could stay and drink a beer. And I was like, sure, this guy seems like he really just needs to talk to some people or something. And I wasn't doing anything, and he seems normal enough, so why not? I did think he might have only been there because I looked like a girl who was alone, if he hadn't noticed the hammock. But I thought at most he would be mildly disappointed he couldn't hit on me or whatever. My boyfriend popped his head up at some point, and the hiker did seem surprised to see him, which confirmed that he thought I was alone. He kept saying stuff like, "Oh, don't worry, I'm not one of those creepy people." Like, okay dude, I hope not. I was trying to be friendly and just ask some basic questions. What about trail stories? And the guy was answering normal enough. My boyfriend and I decided to smoke some weed by the river, and of course offered the guy some, because he had given us the weed in the first place. He hits it and coughs a bunch, and that's when stuff gets weird. As a stoner, we were used to seeing people get too high and act a little weird, but this guy was being incredibly strange. He talked and talked and talked, but it was so quiet we couldn't really hear a thing he said. I tried to seem interested and respond to stuff, but I had no clue what he was saying. He was just staring at the river, talking to himself, and then occasionally looking at us like we were part of the conversation. And me be like, oh, right, ha ha ha. It was so strange and confusing. He also drank like 3 beers at least, and 2 cigarettes during the time, so it was not a short amount of time. This man would not leave. He started talking to Siri on his phone when we stopped answering him, and he was like yelling at Siri, calling her a bitch. At one point out of nowhere, he goes, "On a scale of 1 to 10, how much do I seem like a serial killer?" My boyfriend and I looked at each other like we had both just had the same thought, that this guy had just gotten way too creepy. We both nervously laughed and said, "Oh, 1, meaning not at all for sure." I tried to act casual like it was definitely a joke or something, but we were both thinking, what the fuck? After that, I said, nope, this guy's not welcome here, and I got in the hammock, and so did my boyfriend. And we kind of sat there talking to each other a bit, and not really acknowledging the guy. He had said he was going to smoke 1 more cig and then leave. And I swear, that was the longest cigarette I've ever witnessed in my life. It took him so long to finish it, and I was just watching it get shorter and shorter, hoping he would just leave already. He finally got up and put his stuff on and left. But it was almost dark, so we knew he would not go too far before setting up camp for the night too. That night, we thought for sure this guy would come back and kill us. Throughout the night, people did walk by on the trail multiple times, but it was other people we had seen on the trail during the day. One being a couple that seemed to be on drugs and maybe lived up the trail. We literally planned what we would do if he came back, which was grab the dog and jump in the river and float to the boat ramp downstream. Anyway, he didn't end up showing up that night and we didn't see him again, but it was enough to freak us out. It's possible this guy was just lacking some social skills and also had been in the woods by himself for a while, but it's also possible that he really had some creepy shit going on, and I'm definitely glad I wasn't alone when he walked up. I grew up in southern Appalachia, in western North Carolina, 30 minutes outside of the town of Asheville. The hills and hollers of the Appalachian Mountains are some of the oldest mountains in the world. Some of the rock formations dating back over 1 billion years. That quite literally means they were here before there were terrestrial animals. As with most things that have been on Earth for a long time, there are inexplicable anomalies, both benevolent and malevolent. For example, the Brown Mountain Lights. Never in my life have I felt threatened or uneasy when witnessing them from Wise Man's view. They're neither good nor evil, they just are. On the benevolent side, sometimes you walk through an abandoned old church, up near Mom and Dad's property line. You can feel good, warm, and happy energy. It's like that first warm day of summer, when the sunshine is not too hot, but it's not too cold. Well, this story is not about one such anomaly. It's about something that was definitely malevolent. About a decade ago, I was in night school up at AB Tech, going to school for some automotive mechanics. I would go into class at about 2 p.m. after I got off my part-time job, and I would end up getting home at about 10:30 p.m., depending on the traffic. Every night I drove the same road in my old 1973 W200 Dodge pickup. Some nights it would get rather boring and I would take a different route, jump off of I-40 and drive the back roads. On this particular evening, I had decided to just stay on I-40 because I just wanted to go home and go to bed. It was Thursday and there was no class on Friday, and I wanted to get in bed early so I could go into the woods and go hiking early the next day and watch the sun come up. As I jumped off of I-40 onto the exit where my parents lived, the night seemed to get darker, and none of the animals that I could hear through my rolled-down windows made any more noise. I have never faced any kind of anxiety in my life, but at that moment something felt off, and there was no way I could put my finger on what it was. I came to a stop on the exit ramp, turned to go down the road, and I happened to notice that the gas station off the exit, where Mom and Dad lived, had no lights on. They were a 24-hour truck stop and always had lights on, but I didn't think about it again after noticing. I just chalked it up to the power being out, but I could not shake the feeling that something was definitely askew. I slowly shifted through all of my old truck's gears, not wanting to make any more noise than the old pickup already did. I leaned over my steering wheel to look up at the moon through the windshield, and there were barely any stars visible, which was way out of the ordinary. If you've ever been to Appalachia, primarily the sparsely populated areas where I'm from, you can see the Milky Way on clear nights. An absence of stars back home is only due to cloud cover or whatever in the hell went on this particular night. As I rounded a particularly sharp left-hand curve and chugged through a straight stretch before the next right-hander, I looked at the ancient decaying barn I always gazed at when riding that stretch of road, and thought about how long that thing had been here and how many advancements in civilization it had seen. For the split second that my gaze wandered, a very large, sickly-looking dog ran out in front of my truck, no more than 10 feet in front of me. Old Betsy was a good truck, but she didn't stop well. I heard the fence post I had left in my truck bounce out of my bed and then back into it as I slid to a stop. My first thought was, oh no, now I have to go tell these neighbors that I ran over their dog. That shit doesn't go real far with people around here. It can really set them off depending on the dog and the person. As I sat there breathing in the smell of burning rubber, something else found its way into my nose. The stench of rotting flesh. It's not a smell you forget once you smell it one time. I didn't pay much attention to it at the time. I just chalked it up to some rotting roadkill nearby. Finally, I thought to myself, let me go check and see who this dog belongs to. I pushed my clutch in, shifted to reverse, and as I looked in my rearview mirror, illuminated by the haunting glow of my reverse lamps, was the same dog. Only it wasn't on 4 legs anymore. It had stood up like a man well over 10 foot tall. Only then did it dawn on me that the front of my truck was every bit of 5 feet tall. And this dog was every bit of 5 foot tall at the shoulder on all 4s. As it turned its head to look in the direction of my truck, I caught only a glimpse of this creature. It was not a dog. It was not a man. It was somewhere in between, and at the same time entirely separate altogether. Its skin hung loose, off of its emaciated and thin frame, like a raccoon. Bits of matted fur and dirt and mud clung to its legs like a disease. The right arm seemed a little longer than the left, and they both hung abnormally low, in relation to either animal this creature seemed to be. As it regained its senses, it turned and looked into the mirror, like it knew exactly where I was sitting. The face was that of a man's, but the very edges of its face seemed to not be totally defined. They seemed to move and change like something you would see at a cellular level in a scientific documentary. There were no eyes, but only sockets where eyes should have been. No hair, and the skin that was dripping off of its face was a cold, lifeless gray color. The nose was short and shoved into its face like a bulldog. The teeth still haunt me. It was definitely carnivorous. And true to the form of the rest of its unnatural look, many of the teeth didn't seem to be arranged in a natural way in its mouth. They seemed to fill and spill forth from the indefinable face, almost like they knew the horror they occupied and they were searching for a way out. It stared through my life, into my eyes and past my soul. It seemed like an eternity, but it could have not been more than 5 seconds that I sat there paralyzed. A light came on at the house next to the road, causing the creature to snap its glaze in that direction and tear off into the woods on its back 2 legs, like a man. I jammed my old truck in first gear and roasted tires all the way through first, snatched second gear and drove as fast as I could home. When I got to the house, both of my parents were asleep. I went downstairs into my bedroom and loaded every firearm I possessed and locked all of the doors. I couldn't wake them up. I mean, who the hell would believe that? And at 10:30 on a Thursday night, the basement was eerily quiet that night. Even their dogs that got up to raise hell at outside animals at all hours of the night were dead silent. The old post and beam house didn't even creak or pop that night, as was usual. At about 3 a.m., I started to finally get drowsy, and as I went to lay my head down to get some sleep, so I could still attempt to go hiking the next morning, I smelled the stench of death again. It was faint at first, but it was definitely there. I thought to myself, you're just going crazy. None of that shit was real. But as I dwelt on it, it became more and more noticeable until it filled the entire basement. My dad has a home office in the basement with 2 large glass doors that face National Forest, 500,000-acre woods. I finally worked up the courage to walk out of my bedroom and into the basement living room, with my little tactical 12-gauge loaded, tack light on. I covered the flashlight with my hand, so as not to make my presence known until need be. And as I turned right out of the living room into my father's office, I shined the light through the glass doors and at the edge of the woods. There stood the creature. It was motionless. It stared right into the light, unafraid, with those soulless sockets devoid of eyes. I quickly covered my tactical light, ran into the living room and flipped on the outdoor floodlights, and to my surprise, it was no longer standing at the edge of the woods, but between the house and the edge of the woods. Still motionless, though. I swung the door open and fired every round I had into its direction. I must have scored a couple of hits because it screeched an unearthly scream, like that of a woman being slaughtered, as it took off into the woods. The dogs went crazy. Mom and Dad woke up asking what the hell I was doing. I told them that a bear had gone to the trash and I was scaring it away. They didn't believe me, but I knew they wouldn't believe the truth either. I didn't sleep that night, or any time until the following Sunday. Everything seemed to return to normal, and I didn't think about the creature again until I met my wife about 6 years later. Her mother's house sits at the mouth of the holler, no more than 4 or 5 miles up the road from my mother and father's. Up on the side of the holler, there are kennels for her brother's hunting dogs. No longer in use and haven't been in years, but the fence is still there and the concrete pad is still there. It's a thing of great use when you need to quarantine an animal. Her Great Pyrenees had gotten into a tussle with a raccoon, which of course he destroyed, but his rabies vaccination had lapsed, so we had to keep him quarantined for a time. It didn't bother him, as he kind of liked solitude. This particular night that we were coming home from a movie date in a neighboring town was the last night of quarantine for him. So we walked up the trail using our phone flashlights to get to the kennel, and there he sat, patiently waiting, tail wagging happy to see us. We put him on a leash and started walking back to the house with him. As we were walking back through the darkness, I started to feel the same feeling I had felt the night I hit the creature in my truck. I didn't say anything, so as not to alarm my wife, but then the smell came wafting in on the breeze. She jokingly asked me, "My God, what did you eat? You stink." I half-assed laughed, not being able to fully appreciate the joke for the horrors that raged within my mind. She immediately caught on and asked me what was wrong, to which I could only reply, "I'll tell you later." She grew up in the woods and around hunting and things of that nature her whole life, so she knew what I meant. She knew we were being watched by something. When we could see the lights of the house from the trail to the kennel, we heard it. There came barking from the kennel that sounded just like the Great Pyrenees we had on a leash next to us. It was a perfect imitation. The Pyrenees, being a guardian dog, immediately sensed that something was wrong, and so he turned to face the danger, belting out deep barks and growls in that direction. I don't know if you've ever had to drag a 150-pound dog, but it sucks. And it's not an easy task. I'm 6 foot tall and 240 pounds, and it was all I could do to get him back to the house. The barking never ceased the entire time we were running toward the house. In fact, it seemed to grow closer and closer, till it seemed it was coming from inside my own head. Her mother heard the commotion and flipped the floodlights on as we made it into the fence of the yard, and I caught a glimpse of something coming to a dead stop at the end. At the end of where the light reached, wheeling around and tearing off back into the darkness. My wife looks at me and goes, "You want to tell me what the fuck that was?" To which I replied, "Yes, let's just go inside." I told her the story, and she listened intently, hanging on to every word. Her family came from a long line of granny witches and other supernatural healers of the Appalachians, so her older sister came over the next morning with some herbs and chants to bless the property and to ward off evil. I suggested we go up to the dog kennels and do them as well. When we got to the kennels, they were completely destroyed. The very concrete foundation was cracked, and the chain link fence was torn off of its posts. Dog houses were destroyed, and the place reeked of the stench that followed the creature. My wife's older sister just went about her business like normal, blessed the place, and burned some herbs and led us back into the property. When we got into the house, she wheeled about on us suddenly and instructed us very firmly to never go into the woods after dark. Not until this thing left me alone. To make a long story short, my wife joined the military and she ended up getting stationed in Delaware. Well, as someone who's lived around fairly large mountains and endless wilderness their entire life, Delaware is pretty terrible. At least that was my thought when we first moved to the middle of a 50,000 plus population city. Fortunately though, it didn't take us long to find a house in a sleepy little community further south. We purchased the house and moved in with haste. We were both very grateful and glad to be out of the city and into a rural setting again. The land in Delaware seems lifeless in comparison to Appalachia. The sparsely populated woods don't possess any energy that goes one way or the other. The ground doesn't seem to be alive like it is in Appalachia. Having not thought about the creature in a long time, I resumed my staying outside after dark and playing with our dogs in our rather large yard that borders a small patch of woods. Well, last night, I went outside to play with the dogs, and as dark set in, I built a decent-sized fire in my fire pit and consumed some good old-fashioned Appalachian mountain cough syrup from a mason jar. And just as the fire was dying down, my American bulldog tore off towards the woods. He has a habit of running off to go on adventures, so my immediate instinct was to chase him down in the yard and tackle him so he could not get away. As I tackled his 110-pound ass to the ground and threw him in a fireman's carry over my shoulders, I heard him begin to bark. Only the bark was not coming from him. The only sound coming from him was a deep rumbling growl, a noise I've never really heard him make. It was a threatening noise. Something was definitely wrong, and as I ran with him on my shoulders back to the house, the stench of death again began to fill the air. The two other dogs must have caught wind of what was happening and met me at the back door, which I threw open, slammed shut, locked, and again loaded my firearms. How the hell could this thing have followed us 650 miles up here? As I flipped my floodlights on, the backside of my house, several of the bushes and small trees at the forest's edge were still shaking like something had just run through them. My dogs went crazy all night, barking and howling and attempting to get out of the windows. I didn't sleep a bit, and I don't think I will for a while. I know for sure I won't be in the woods after dark ever again in my life. Not until this thing is gone. Originally, I'm from West Virginia. I moved around between the Appalachian and the Midwest some as a kid. Between the ages of 10 to 13, I lived in rural Kentucky in the foothills of one of the oldest mountain ranges on the planet. I lived with my dad and my grams. We lived in kind of like a cul-de-sac in between a set of foothills. We lived in the middle of the neighborhood with nothing but my family on both sides. No one lived across from us or behind us because of the foothills. When I moved in, my grandma had some rules I had to follow. At the time, I chalked them up to hillbilly stranger danger. They were saying like don't mess around with the wild animals, don't go into the woods alone, and then they got a little weird. If you hear your name, don't answer it and don't go to it. And if you see someone in the woods you might know, no you didn't, just come home. This experience happened in August when I was 11. My dad and I had mowed a path through the tall grass and berry bushes to the left of the double wide we lived in. We camped out there a lot because it was close enough that we could check on my grandma. Now when you're in the woods, things are louder than you think. You have animal life, bugs chattering, wind through the trees and grass. There was a stream that ran along the road you could easily hear. That night, we added the campfire to that list. My dad decided to go back up to the house about a quarter mile to get more beer and to check on Grandma. Before he left, he told me to not mess with the fire. After a few minutes of watching the fire, things started to get quiet, like real quiet. The wind had all but stopped, bug and animal sounds were all gone, and the stream sounded like it was miles away. I was getting uncomfortable, even though I'd been left at the campground before like this. Then I started to smell and taste it. It was in the back of my throat out of nowhere. This awful metal tang. After a few more moments of dread, my dad came back. He was mad right away. Said he could smell burning metal coming up the trail. He accused me of tossing beer cans in the fire. I told him I didn't, and even pointed to the fire to prove it. He said there was a storm coming in, and we needed to get back home, and he let it go. We left the tent and started our way back. Now the very cool but very weird thing about lightning in the woods this dense is when the lightning lights up everything like the middle of the day, well up into the front of the trees. After the first set of trees, it's pitch black. There are no street lights, and unless you have lights on your property, it's completely black. So it's pitch black, lightly raining, and other than dim lights from the house windows, there's nothing. I'm eating watermelon as one does in August in the mountains when the first clap of lightning hits. Everything is as bright as it can be. After the second passes, it's pitch black. Next clap of lightning comes, and that's when I kind of see it. On the porch, past the yard, over the stream, past the road, and the ditches on either side, just past the first line of trees. I could see the silhouette of it. Then it goes dark. This is also when I can start to taste the same awful burning metal. I'm not really sure what I saw, so I kind of just stay still. It's a few moments before the lightning hits again. The figure is now closer, standing side by side to the trees. I'm standing now, I'm not sure what to do. Not wanting to see it again or get any closer, I run inside. My grandma is doing dishes and ask why I'm inside. I tell her I think I saw something. She almost immediately gets my dad on his feet, telling him to shut and lock all the windows and doors. My dad, vaguely drunk, obeys. That night I sleep with her, and the next day we discover the tent door is torn off. It didn't look like an animal. Things weren't cut or shredded, but it looked like someone took and pulled it apart. My uncle, who lived a mile or so up, had all 8 chickens killed, heads gone, but no blood. The next few weeks, all the kids had to wait for the bus with an adult. My dad had to be late for work for almost 3 weeks. Anytime I tried to talk about it, I just had the subject changed. I just figured I was a kid and it wasn't important or real, but it wasn't until years later I finally understood. I was in my early 20s and some cousins were in town for Halloween. As I was telling this story, my aunt got irate with me, saying, "Don't you tell them that. Don't you put that evil on them." After I couldn't help but think back on all the times I tried to talk about it and how I was shunned. My kid mind not realizing it wasn't as simple as a subject change, but then actively shushing me. Once I started dipping my toes in Reddit, I realized there was a name for this thing. The same name my auntie had called it that day at the party, and other people have seen it. The Goat Men. What bothers me the most is how to this day I couldn't describe any feature, nor have I ever tasted that awful burning metal taste. So friends, if you ever find yourself in the foothills of Kentucky, please remember my grandma's rules. I once had a close friend who was an avid hiker. We will call her Annie for the sake of keeping her identity safe. She spent most of her free time hiking trails in and around the Appalachian region of Tennessee and North Carolina. No matter what the time of year was, she would always be out hiking. One summer, she decided to spend a few weeks hiking the Appalachian Trail. She wasn't going to do the full thing. She just intended to start at the beginning in Springer Mountain, Georgia, and finish up at the Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. I was all for it and encouraged her to do it. I even helped her prepare, and we even arranged for me to meet her where the trail crossed through the Newfound Gap area in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I was going to bring her new supplies and hike for a few days with her along the trail while she was in the park, close by to where I lived at the time. The time came for her to begin her journey, and I drove her to the trailhead, dropping her off and left behind a very excited and determined Annie. During the first few weeks of her journey, I received several postcards from her as she would stop in and pick up her pre-arranged packages containing re-ups of food and supplies. She would write as often as she could to assure me that she was safe and making good time. Eventually, July rolled around, and it was getting close to when I was going to meet her. Before she left, we had sat down and figured out about when she would be reaching the backcountry shelter we were set to meet at. July 10th was the day we settled on. She was supposed to send me a postcard from the last re-up spot before when we were set to meet. And true to all of her previous cards, I received one detailing that she felt great, that she was on schedule to meet me at the Mount LeConte shelter on July 7th. I had received the card on July 2nd. We were going to stay at the lodge for the evening and have dinner and rest up before continuing the trail. Mount LeConte Lodge was one of the more popular destinations in the park, and you had to make the reservation months in advance in order to have a shelter for one night. It was important that we stayed true to our schedule, and Annie knew this very well. I gathered up all of the supplies we would need and had my then boyfriend drive me to the trailhead. He was going to hike with me to the shelter and leave once I had met up with Annie. We had a great time hiking there, enjoying the breathtaking views of the Smokies, while panting and sweating our way up the steep climbs. Eventually, we made it to the shelter, and I fully expected Annie to be there waiting for us. It was mid-afternoon, and we had been running an hour or two behind schedule. We went to the front desk to see if she had made it and checked in, only to find out that she had not arrived yet. We didn't think much of it because you can't be completely sure when someone is going to arrive with this kind of stuff, so we took our gear and settled in our bunker. We went up to the lodge and had some coffee and leisurely enjoyed our books and the views while waiting for Annie to arrive. Sunset came and she still hadn't shown up. This is when I began to get worried. My boyfriend and I walked over to the office and asked if anyone named Annie had tried to check in, and to our dismay, no one had. We went back to our shelter and my boyfriend tried to calm me down as my anxiety began to take over. She's probably running behind schedule. The trails in this area of the park reach the highest elevations of the entire Appalachian. She probably got worn out and fell behind track, he assured me. If she doesn't get here tonight, she'll probably make it by tomorrow. Don't worry. I tried to let his words soothe my worries as we lay down for rest, but I endured a long sleepless night. She didn't show up the next day. We waited at the office for hours, but she never came. Around 2 in the afternoon, we decided to hike down the trail towards the direction she was due to be coming from. We told the lady at the